journalism under digital siege. Thank you so much for our guests who have been waiting online. Among them is Will Cathcart, head of WhatsApp, connected from Menlo Park in California. Timnit Gebru, founder and executive director of the Distributed Artificial Intelligence Research Institute, and Shoshana Zuboff, Harvard professor emeritus, connected from Cambridge in Massachusetts. Professor Zuboff, thank you so much for being with us. One of your masterpieces and bestseller is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Two words that have to do with the current crisis independent media are experiencing. Recent developments in surveillance by state and non-state actors have been proved to be a major threat to the freedom and safety of investigative journalists around the world, while the viability of the current media model is challenged by the evolution of capitalism and by the business models of big tech companies. This World Press Freedom Conference has an overall theme, which is journalism under digital siege. This is to spotlight the multifaceted ways in which technology and means of surveillance, as well as big data collection and artificial intelligence, impact journalism, freedom of expression, and privacy. Also to be discussed are the associated challenges to media viability in digital times and threats to public trust that arise from surveillance and digitally mediated attacks on journalists. We would like you to navigate us on what are the technological developments and how they impact on both the universal right to freedom of expression and the work of journalists.
I want to thank our organizers and our hosts of this seminal meeting. Special greetings and thanks to El Presidente. It's an honor to share this event with you. And of course, to UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay. Welcome, Your Excellencies. And to all those who are joining us in Punta del Este, I certainly wish I could be in Uruguay right now, and to those who are joining us around the world. It's easy to forget that just 2 decades ago, barely 25% of the world's information was digital. Today, nothing escapes this web. It is our shared fate and our privilege to live at the dawn of information civilization. But what kind of future will this be? What legacy will we leave to our children, our people, and the generations beyond? In an information civilization, our lives are rendered as and mediated by information. But what is the quality of this information? Who knows this information? Who decides who knows this information? And who decides who knows? These are the essential questions of knowledge, authority, and power that now define our social order. In this year of 2022, across so many of our societies, it is the surveillance capitalist firms, beginning with the giants, Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and their ecosystems, that hold the answers to each of these questions, though we never elected them to govern. In a mere 2 decades, surveillance capitalism grew from baby startups into a global institutional order, intermediating virtually all human engagement with digital architectures across every domain of everyday life. The giants and their ecosystems now own all the data about all the people. And they own the data science and the scientists, the cables, computers, and clouds. They control the global market in knowledge production, known as artificial intelligence and machine learning. They decide what becomes knowledge, who knows it, and to what purpose. The question is, how did this happen? From the dawn of the World Wide Web in the mid-1990s, the liberal democracies failed. They failed to construct a coherent political vision of a digital century that advances democratic values, principles, and governance. This failure left a void where democracy should be. That void was most extreme in America, my country, where an ideology of radical market freedom persuaded lawmakers to consign the new networked information and communication spaces to private control, while diminishing democratic prerogatives and power. America's fledgling internet startups quickly filled the void with a novel digital age economics of surveillance capitalism based on the secret capture and datafication of human experience. Such taking without asking is normally called theft. And it was on the strength of this theft that human data were aggregated on an industrial scale and claimed as the corporate property of the companies, available for new methods of computation, behavioral prediction, and sales. The first breakthrough, famously, was the click-through rate that revolutionized online advertising with surveillance-based targeting. Surveillance capitalism now, however, reorders every domain of economic activity. When human data are hunted prey, a great deal of bait must be continuously set into the trap. The bait was also part of the big taking, including all the web pages, all the books, the music, the bodies, the cars, shops, homes, classrooms, hospitals, maps of all the territories, streets, buildings, houses, and all the news. The more bait, the more engagement. Then the more data extraction and the more predictions and the more revenues. Most critical to understand here for us gathered today is the fate of information under surveillance capitalism and its debasement of journalism and of journalists. These vast machine systems are designed to treat information as a bulk commodity, like tons of wheat or barrels of oil. They are built for volume production without any capability to distinguish information integrity from corruption. A leaked Facebook document describes its artificial intelligence hub as ingesting trillions of data points each day to produce thousands of models and 6 million behavioral predictions per second. That is what I mean by volume and industrial scale. Meaning, facts, and truth are simply not in the picture. And why? Because in the logic of surveillance capitalism, information integrity has no bearing on revenues. On the contrary, as we have seen all too painfully, corrupt information has proven quite good for business as it drives more extraction. The system demands our engagement, but it is radically indifferent to what engages us. This structural blindness to information integrity has produced an eternal Christmas morning for every autocratic power, oligarch, political bad actor, troll farm, state-sponsored or grassroots disinformation campaign, now able to sidestep the blind side and inject whatever they please into the global information bloodstream without sanction. Thus empowered, these same actors refuse to let journalists stand in their way as machine systems drive revenue by vaulting corrupt information into the very center of social discourse, extinguishing all vestiges of an autonomous public square. From the ancestral disciplines of oral witness to the traumatic shift from the spoken to the written word, to the institutionalization of the fourth estate, each turn in the material history of information and communication asserted standards of information integrity and the means of enforcing those standards. Until now, instead, what we have witnessed is the alienation of news content from institutional zones of public and professional laws, rules, norms, and standards. And this has produced conditions that no democracy can survive. Most poignant is how news organizations have had to submit to surveillance capitalism in order to survive. I'm struck by the fact that as early as 2011, in the Pew Research's annual report on the state of the news media that year, the report observed, quote, "The future will belong to those who understand the public's changing behavior and can target content and advertising to snugly fit the interests of each user. That knowledge and the expertise in gathering it increasingly resides with technology companies outside of journalism." My friends, we have stumbled into a future that we did not and would not choose. Ours is an accidental dystopia, a global zero-sum game in which the deepening order of surveillance capitalism produces deepening democratic disorder, eroding the social fabric as the prelude to a wider contest over the politics of knowledge in our emerging civilization. We were too complacent. We were too apathetic. We took democracy and its institutions of the fourth estate for granted. We did not understand the fragility and the threats. We did not fight. We allowed ourselves to be bystanders. However, this tide has turned. I stand before you today more optimistic than I have ever been that the democratic order and journalism's renewed centrality to that order will win this contest. All roads now lead through politics, collective action, and lawmaking. The last 3 years have been marked by a largely unheralded but powerful sea change on these very frontiers. In America, in Europe, and in nearly every world region, there has been a wholesale rupture of the public's faith in the tech companies and the future they seek to impose. Tech employees are finally breaking ranks in record numbers, and lawmakers are on the move for the first time with a steady crescendo of legislative initiatives, even in a once reluctant America. And I'm so pleased that we're having this gathering today, because it was just last week that the European Union added rocket fuel to this mix with a powerful political agreement on the Digital Services Act. This legislation represents a bold reckoning with history, the first comprehensive declaration of a democratic digital future founded on the legitimate authority of democratic rights and rule of law. The DSA breaks the sound barrier of surveillance capitalism's aura of inevitability and invincibility. It asserts that the digital must live in democracy's house. It means that for the first time in 2 decades, there is hope that the principles of a self-governing demos might survive the digital century. This 3rd decade that we have entered must be a crucial turning point when we set ourselves on the long overdue work of reinvention, not simply regulation. We need to reckon with the most basic questions of how to reinvent our connected information domains in order that they advance the aspirations and ideals of democratic societies. This means new charters of rights and new laws to oversee them and new institutions purpose-built for our time to govern their application, all under the rule of public law. The next years will be tough, requiring unflinching muscle and determination. And though surveillance capitalism is the younger challenger, it embodies many novel strengths that have been rapidly transformed into reliable means. But the corporations do not hold all the cards. And the young entrepreneurial pioneers of the internet, once hailed as heroes, are now more like addled, aging emperors, unhinged by the absolute power that our democracies bestowed upon them. While democracy may be the old and slow incumbent, it brings advantages that are difficult to rival. These include the ability to inspire democratic action, to inspire fear in adversaries, and most formidable, the legitimate authority and requisite power to make, to impose, and to enforce the democratic rule of law based on cherished values, ideals, and principles. In closing, it teaches us that whatever has been made by people can be unmade by people when we stand together. Thank you so much. A privilege to be with you here today.
Thank you so much, Professor Zuboff, for this in-depth analysis. Please stay with us. We have now the first round of questions to our distinguished panel. We're going to be talking about the digital challenges for journalists today.
Le pido por favor a los oradores que están acá presentes, el doctor Marcelo.
Dr. Marcelo Bechara, Director of Institutional Relations for Globo Group, a member of the Broadcasters Association. Claudia Duque, research journalist from Colombia. She has received many journalist awards. And Irene Khan, Special UN Rapporteur on the promotion of freedom of expression. In this ceremony, we have listened to the President and UN authorities. They've spoken about transparency, democracy, freedom of expression, surveillance, moratorium on software, espionage, journalist attacks. And now we're going to go deeper into some of these topics. The Irene Khan, and it is an honor to have you here in Uruguay. Thank you so much for traveling, UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. The first question, considering the increasing sophistication and the impossibility to detect malware and spyware as they're being used against journalists and human rights defenders by so many state actors and non-state actors, do you think that this is really endangering free and independent journalism?
Or please.
Thank you.
We need interpretation.
My apologies. I'm not as proficient in Spanish as I'm sure you are in English. Well, actually, what we see happening is very dangerous. Like the data theft of digital platforms that Professor Zuboff was talking, because it all happens without knowledge, without awareness, without a click. Technology has progressed to such an extent that this surveillance that takes place, and here we are now talking about targeted surveillance, not data theft, but targeted surveillance of journalists, are taking place with a technology that moves into their equipment without them even realizing it. And they can see, they can hear, they can collect any data that they want. And what does that do? It destroys journalism, because journalism needs to have freedom to be able to investigate and collect information. And very importantly, it destroys the trust of journalistic sources, because they are also put into danger. Now, the companies that provide these tools tell us that they are only selling it to states for lawful use, and states tell us that they're using it only for lawful surveillance of crime and terrorism. But we know, thanks to the research, thanks to the publication, that actually hundreds of journalists, human rights defenders, and activists have been subjected to this. And I want to point out the gender dimension of it. The information that is being collected, the conversations that women journalists have had, the data about where they live, what they do, is then used in smear campaigns and in endangering their safety. So it is a form of gender-based violence as well against women. And the consequences can be disastrous. It can lead to people being killed, attacked, imprisonment, abuse, and, of course, intimidation. So it really kills journalists. And it also happens across territories. So it's not only in your own country. We know that the clients of NSO can operate across, and other companies operate across borders. So it is also extraterritorial, which makes it very difficult to seek protection from. And remember, this is not happening in isolation. It's happening in the context of other pressures that journalists face. So it's a very, very dangerous trend.
Thank you very much. La siguiente pregunta es para Claudia Duque.
The next question is addressed to Claudia Duque. Considering your career and the attacks that you have suffered as a journalist, the question is, do you see any links, do you see any ties between digital attacks and the attacks that we suffer in real life, so to speak? Yes, I've been working this for over 20 years, where unfortunately I have suffered firsthand the development of technology and the way in which such development affects and has an impact in persecution methods that we as journalists are subjected to. 20 years ago, in 2001, I was kidnapped. And while I was kidnapped, I was told that my kidnappers knew exactly what I did, what I was doing, what I was working on, and they threatened me. They threatened me because of the research that I was undertaking. In 2003, 2004, I was tortured. I suffered psychological torture that now it's been proved thanks to evidence that I provided, and emails and phone calls, and that evidence that every single word of those threats that I received that qualify as torture are based on very specific analysis that Colombian Secret Service would do to really be able to reach their destination and to end my aspirations in the country. Today, in 2021, 20 years later, under a protection program of the Colombian government, that it is considered a protection mechanism, a very robust mechanism, and the most robust in the world, We discovered how the bulletproof car that I was provided with for my protection was equipped inside with different espionage devices. So this has become a mobile espionage vehicle. So you can be followed through all of the GPS devices that were fitted inside, that are connected with any system, any device that you might have, Wi-Fi modem, drones, cell phones. It will connect for greater accuracy and geolocalization. And in the first 6 months of the pandemic, where we were, most of us locked down, they were able to gather over 25,000 pieces of data on my movements. They can also shut down the vehicle remotely. They can unlock the vehicle remotely. They can block all transmission signs, so I could issue no warnings or no alerts. So who are we subjected to in this protection mechanism? Under this mechanism, I was told that all of these instruments were for my own protection, but really I was not told that this was going on. And when I asked for an informed consent, I was asked to be treated under Colombian law and international treaties, but I was told that once you are protected, you are disclosing your privacy, and that nothing would happen because that information would only be made available to the government ruling this program. Actually, this program inherited 600 staff from the former Secret Service in the country, the Secret Service that had subjected me to these activities. So to gather 3,000 pages of evidence many years ago, you needed a large staff, you needed to tap phones and so on. But now to gather 25,000 pieces of data in 6 months, and the family, where you go, who your sources are, and everything that you do, it can be done in real time. And in addition to these vehicles have equipment that can capture footage, can record your conversations inside or out the vehicle, and it is also fitted with sensors and cameras, which through infrared technology can register how many people there are in the vehicle. And there are also very small devices that we really don't even see, collect thousands of data across the 6 months of the pandemic. So the government really hid information from me, and they compiled information without my knowing. And they're saying that the state is also saying that they have that much amount of information for the past 10 years. So I cannot even imagine how much information they have kept on myself. I am not a drug dealer. I am not a criminal. So I wonder, why would the state do this with someone who is supposedly a protected person? We have over 4,000 protected people in Colombia, over 100 of these who are journalists. So I have been a victim of persecution for many years, and new technologies have really made it easier for states to do so. They go unpunished, and it is more socially acceptable now to do so, or even legally accepted, because the judges in the country say exactly the same thing, that we should thank the fact that we are under a protection program, and therefore we have to hand over our right to privacy, as privacy would be considered as a lesser right. And this is a favor that they are doing to us, and that they are going to guard these data. But really, I have no access to my own personal data, only they do. In 2015, for example, an armed man followed me. He was carrying my picture, and he really had available GPS data. I could clearly see it. In February, I was a victim of intimidation while I was driving a vehicle. And on that same day, at the National Protection Unit, they were able to follow my every second and my localization. So I know there is a link between, and the fact that it goes unpunished is what I think is worse. It's not just about private companies anymore, but rather the states are using these technologies, and the judges who accept it. George? Orwell couldn't have said it better. He couldn't have imagined it.
You're the head of WhatsApp, and one of the platforms that we journalists use every day, human rights activists use every day. Encryption and private messaging is very, very important, as we were just listening to Claudia Duque's testimony. What is your perspective on the threats encryption faces around the world? Mr. Cathcart?
Mr. Cathcart, are you there?
Okay, he's coming.
Can you guys hear me?
¿Me escuchan?
Some technical difficulties. Yeah, first of all,
Tenemos
thank you
ciertas
so much for
dificultades.
yeah, we think encryption is incredibly important for not just journalists. It's especially important for journalists, but really for everyone. So for those that don't know, WhatsApp uses end-to-end encryption, which means when you send a message on WhatsApp, we can't see it. It's secure and only goes to whoever you sent it to. And if you just think about how much people are using messaging services to have sensitive, private conversations, talking to their doctors, to their loved ones, sending things like business plans or financial information, it's incredibly important that it be secure and that they don't need to choose to share that content, share that message with a private company. But this is especially important for journalists. I mean, Special Rapporteur Khan talked about the dangers of spyware and how horrifying it is that journalists are being targeted for their private sensitive communications, which undermines, as she pointed out, the trust sources have in talking to journalists. It undermines the ability for whistleblowers to talk to a journalist, which in the end undermines journalism and undermines our ability to have a free society where people in power are held to account and held to check. So it's incredibly important. Unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of pressure from different governments around the world against end-to-end encryption. Sometimes this comes up very overtly, where a government will ask for a backdoor. So they will ask for the ability to read anyone's private message. There's no way to create a way for a government to read it, but not expose a security hole for a spyware company or a hostile government or foreign government to read someone's messages. But sometimes governments will ask for other things, like the ability to scan for only certain types of content. They'll say, we don't need to see everything, but please go and detect, be it maybe terrorism or more recently child safety content that's inappropriate or illegal or heinous, and block just that. Well, once you've done that, you've created a way to scan the private conversations people are having. And we've seen calls from some governments for a concept called traceability, which is tell us who first said something. Tell us who first said this thing that was inappropriate, but also could be who first said this first thing that was politically undesirable. And we're seeing this all around the world. We're seeing in the UK, the government has been very vocal about opposition to encryption at times. They're discussing right now the Online Safety Act. We've seen in Brazil at times calls for the concept of traceability and things like fake news legislation. We've seen in India a mandate requiring companies to do traceability. We've challenged that mandate in court as inconsistent with the privacy guarantees of the Indian Constitution. And recently we've seen calls in the EU for scanning for child sexual abuse material. So everywhere we're seeing this, the message I hope to deliver, I know many of you here are already loud about this, which we're grateful for, but the message I hope to deliver is weakening encryption, no matter how noble the goal might be you're trying to solve, weakening encryption hurts everyone. There is no magic solution to weakening encryption that would help only good guys and not bad guys. And when you look at how important encryption is for the work journalists do, as well as human rights defenders and civil society and everyone, we think weakening it would be a tragic mistake. So grateful for all the work everyone is doing to be vocal about this. I do think it requires people and organizations speaking up. We're proud to support the new Alliance for Encryption in Latin America and the Caribbean, proud to support the Global Encryption Coalition and all the people around the world who are fighting for this. We'd love to get to a place where we're also seeing governments loudly support encryption. I think it is unfortunate that our experience right now is with governments mostly pushing us to weaken security. I would love to get to a place where governments are pushing private companies to have even stronger security and collect even less data than they normally would. So we could use everyone's help being loud about this, and in particular, the impact it has on journalism all around the world. Thank you, and thank you again for having me.
Another issue we're going to talk about is artificial intelligence. And for that, my question is to Timnit Gebru. She's an expert on the issue. Artificial intelligence is being used for surveillance of journalist movements, trolling of journalists, especially women. It's been used to attack minority groups, women, among others. So my question to you is, what is the impact of artificial intelligence on freedom of expression?
For this question, I'm seeing the intersection of so many things in this issue that we're talking about, and hearing the experiences of all these journalists, some of whom I'm actually collaborating with. So there is the intersection of racism, colonialism, and as Karen Howe, who used to be reporter at the MIT Tech Review, has this series called AI Colonialism. And of course, as Shoshana Zuboff's book discusses surveillance capitalism. So there is all of this intersection with AI that, or are right now specifically deep learning methods that require lots and lots of data that are labeled, often by people who are completely exploited, have absolutely no rights. So there was just an article recently about content moderators who indirectly work for Facebook in Kenya, and how they were exploited and barely paid. I'm talking about less than $5,000 a year. And so it's like a reincarnation of colonialism in my opinion. And there is a lot more that hasn't been said on that end. There is this ideology, almost like a religious ideology, that is very popular among all of the billionaires right now, including Elon Musk, etc., called long-termism, where it's all about artificial general intelligence and how we should maximize future human potentials, and at the cost of current human potential. And if you really read up on it, it's to me a reincarnation of modern day eugenics. So there is a lot happening here at the intersection of AI, racism, colonization, and what we're talking about in terms of journalism under attack, to me, is under that. So for instance, when I was at Google, I also happen to be born and raised in Ethiopia, and I'm of Eritrean descent. And Eritrea is the world's most censored country, the lowest internet penetration rate. And in Ethiopia, there is a genocide in Tigray right now, where over 500,000 people have died. So on the one hand, we have that the media has really not covered this, something that should be front page of every news. On the other hand, we have people who are using social media to raise awareness, but then we also have this transnational repression that is going on, where this kind of dictators have, thrown their tentacles across nations, and a lot of journalists have are self-censoring. So my colleague calls this mute news. So one of my colleagues that I hired at Google at the very end, right before I got fired, is Moroccan, and he's actually somebody who is a victim of this transnational repression. And his friends who are journalists, like Omar Radi, were one of the first people to be victims of the Pegasus spyware, etc. So what I'm saying is, all of us AI researchers, many of us, are at the intersections of these things, and we've been trying to raise the alarm. And when we raise the alarm, we get retaliated against, right? So collective action is key. In terms of AI specifically, the intersection of the scale that everybody wants to have. So in social media networks, for instance, you have all of these people that are unpaid laborers, right? Doing the kind of the labeling of raising the alarm of misinformation, etc., who are unpaid. They're not making money. And so if we had a situation where the data laborers behind all of these systems, whether it's social media networks or other forms of quote unquote AI, then these companies wouldn't rush to adopt all of these systems, because it wouldn't make sense in market-wise to scale, because you're paying the appropriate amount to these data people who are actually powering these quote-unquote automated systems, because they're not truly automated. There's a whole army of people who are not being compensated for, who are labeling this data. So that's kind of my, what I would say, which is at the heart of it. And as I've been raising the alarm about a new crop of models called large language models that actually generate language, and they can generate it at generate certain kinds of text. They can generate it at scale. They can sound super coherent. So now you can start to see even more of this extremist ideology or misinformation that is coupled with social media platforms, and that is kind of proliferated everywhere. And just like deepfakes, so deepfakes are images or videos or audio that can be generated, and we see on social media a lot of people with social media accounts with faces that are generated, fake faces that are generated with deepfakes that then assume certain kinds of personalities and harass journalists and others. I've been harassed too. And so you can see, imagine this language that's generated in conjunction with this fake images and audio that are generated being proliferated. But at the same time, a lot of experts on misinformation talk about, even if you don't see a lot of these fake generated texts, just the notion, the fact that they exist can be a really big problem, because people can say everything is fake when they want to suppress dissent, right? So that's also the other issue. So for me, this is at the intersection of the new colonial order that AI is creating. So I really highly suggest reading Karen Howe's a series on that. The labor practices that are so exploitative that come with this extractive colonial order, because the data laborers are not getting paid. And if they were, all of these companies would not rush to adopt these techniques. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Timnit. Ahora volvemos a la perspectiva de los...
Let us go back to the media with Dr. Bechara, who is Director of Institutional Relations of the Globo Group. The question is, what do you think is the impact in media operations of surveillance, trolling, online attacks, the regulation of private information for journalists as a manner?
It's a pleasure to talk with experts that I admire at most. Well, there is not journalism that is under siege. It's democracy itself. That's what we're talking about. All human activities, from agriculture to religion, are being impacted for digital revolution since the beginning of in the middle of the 90s, when the commercial internet exploded. And journalism is not different, because it's pure communication. In the past, journalists used to have the monopoly of information. It's not bad at all, because there was method, a technique, that is professionalism. With the Web 2.0 and social media, everyone can be a kind of, a sort of journalist. And we are facing now a different time with the threat of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism, that they are targeting journalism, a people's enemy. Who really believes that the journalists are people's enemy? And there is, so media companies and media outlets, yes, has the responsibility to protect their professionals. What we must have is a global journalism shield, a global journalism protection. That's what we need. That's what we need to discuss. In the case of the company that I work for, Globo, we have a huge and a big program and it's a mandatory program for all the employees, including, of course, journalists, to learn and to engage in the culture of security of information. We have, of course, specific channels for whistleblowers, ombudsmen, in order to make any kind of denounce of attacks against journalists, not only in virtual space, but in real space, because all this strange time that we're living now, when we come first with the isolation of social media, then turns to intolerance. The intolerance, the third pace is violence. And the last is barbarian. And we are close to barbarian. We are very close to barbarian. Not only in Brazil, but everybody, every place we go, we're so divided, we're so angry. And what makes this in the same level around all the world was the pandemic. Because the pandemic was a global event. So the pandemic put everybody in the same place. Everybody was afraid, everybody was isolated, and the infodemia becomes bigger and bigger and shows the problem that we are facing. And we in a kind of resgate the importance of journalism. I don't know if you know, but in Brazil, the official data, we don't have official data from the government saying how many people are sick, ill, or die of COVID-19. We have made a concert of media outlets to collect these numbers and shows every day for the Brazilian people. So what we're talking is that the journalism, and I agree with the professor, I'm optimistic about this moment, journalism is resurgent in a new way. It's different, it's hard, it's painful, but it's a new way. And we have to create measures to protect them. And it's this, yes, the responsibility of media outlets and media companies to do that. It used to be, it's not really something new, it's different, it's more powerful. Surveillance, it's not new, it's not something digital. It happens since everywhere. We live here in a region, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, that in the 70s and 80s, we faced the dictatorship. And at the time, censor was to make, it's all about silence. Censor is to make about silences, silence voices. Now it's the opposite. Censorship is about screaming and screaming loud, and millions and millions of voices screaming fake news, misinformation, and trying to confuse the public opinion. So media literacy and information literacy and media education are so important, and it is a role of the media companies to fight against these million voices that are trying to confuse the public opinion. So yes, we have this responsibility, and we have to unite forces and maybe create what I'm calling this global journalism shield, a worldwide protection, to create mechanisms, not only social mechanisms, but technological mechanisms. The big techs, they have the responsibility to provide us some of these tools. And more, we have to talk about the sustainability of media. It's not a discussion here from taxis against Ubers that say we are old and you are new. No, we're talking about the professionalism of information. And our information, the information that the journalists produce, is the content that social media use to make profit. So it's reasonable they can pay for the use of this information. They pay professionals, they pay journalists, they pay media outlets. So I believe we have to see what is happening in Australia, what is happening in part of Europe, what is happening now in Canada, and the discussion that we are having in the fake news bills in Brazil that is trying to address this issue of make media more sustainable. With media more sustainable, media more healthy, we are making journalism more healthy. And with journalism more healthy, we have democracy. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, doctor Bechara.
Thank you.
Y después de esta primera...
And after this first round of questions and answers, we will try to find solutions. And Dr. Bechara, I will start with you again, and I will ask you all, please, to provide very brief questions. Maybe keep it under a minute. And you did mention something in this regard, but what do you think is the role that employers play in making sure that there is a digital security for journalists, even freelance journalists? And what would be the role of security heads in the press room?
I believe the companies and the professionals, they have to unite themselves and create programs, specific programs of protection. And the government has, we have to trust in some kind of government or part of the government, but the government itself, they have to provide solutions in order to protect this kind of activity that is so important for democracy. In our case, we are so engaged in providing our professionals all the tools. Thanks in Brazil, we don't have the Ukrainian situation, but we have the surveillance situation, of course, and threats to journalists. So we provide a protection with programs and education, and we try to train all this professional to deal with the situation. We have a kind of a crisis offices in order to protect. We have some situations, and all the situations this professional is, and his family, of course, or his or her family, are involved and protected. And we believe we need to collaborate with police forces and government, because not only the company itself, but also the state is responsible for protecting this activity.
So now my question is to Timnit, Gebru. Back to you. Last year, UNESCO adopted what is known as a first global normative instrument on the ethics of artificial intelligence. It talks about international law. It talks about the right to privacy, among other things. How do you think that these recommendations, how this ethics should be implemented? What are your recommendations on this?
Make sure I understand, because it was going in and out a bit. So you're asking me about the UNESCO recommendations on ethics?
That's correct.
And what I think.
And how you would implement, such recommendations. How should countries around the world, how should journalists around the world implement it?
Yeah, I'm hearing my echo, so maybe we could mute one of the things.
Yeah,
let me try to mute something.
How do you suggest implementing the recommendations on artificial intelligence around the world?
Perfect, now I can hear it. So I think the problem is that there are a lot of these, what do you call, guidelines that companies, large tech companies have. So for instance, after an uproar of a project called Maven at Google, they wrote some guidelines. But the problem is that they become what people call ethics washing. These guidelines are not really followed. They're very vague. So at the heart of a lot of, I've been going on this rabbit hole for a long time. Some of my work relates to math. So, kind of attacking the problem mathematically. Some of my work is about documentation, etc. But at the heart of it, in my opinion, is exactly what Shoshana Zuboff wrote about, surveillance capitalism. And at the heart of it is the exploitation of labor and extractive practices. So as long as labor protections are not front and center, and as long as people can have, whether it's, like for instance, this article I mentioned about Kenyan, content moderators in Kenya being exploited, or in the US, people who are unable to speak up against unethical practices. In my opinion, as long as we don't have that kind of protection, no kind of ethical guidelines that we have will be followed, because people will be too scared to speak up, or they'll be retaliated against when they speak up, like I was. So whatever kind of guidelines we have to have enforcement, some sort of enforcement mechanisms, and I think at the heart of that is protection of labor practices. So I'm not sure if that wholly answers your question, but that's really my point of view on this matter. I can actually share an op-ed I wrote saying exactly those things in the chat, and maybe some people can read it later.
Thank you very much. Our next question is going to be with Mr. Cathcart from WhatsApp. We're seeing an alarming increase of mal and spyware around the world being used against human rights activists, against journalists. What is a company like WhatsApp doing in order to help people protect itself or protect its users? Could you talk to us a little bit about that? And we don't have a lot of time, so sorry to be rushing.
No, I'll be brief. Yeah, this is a terrifying trend. I mean, I think it has reached a crisis that there is an out-of-control spyware industry that is targeting journalists and human rights defenders by selling their exploits all around the world. I mean, we all, at this point, carry a phone in our pocket everywhere. The idea that someone could hack into it and listen to us going about our day is terrifying for everyone, but especially journalists. This is not new for us. So what we've been doing, we detected an attack from the NSO group in 2019. We obviously defeated the attack and continued to add security to WhatsApp to make it harder for them to hack through us. But we wanted to do more than that. And so we worked with the Citizen Lab organization out of the University of Toronto to understand everything we could about the attack, understand everything we could about Pegasus and also the victims, and to reach out to them directly, to have Citizen Lab talk to the journalists and human rights defenders who've been targeted so they knew what they could do. But we also wanted to do more to raise awareness around the problem. So we went public with what we learned. We joined the Special Rapporteur's call for a moratorium on the spyware industry. And we've sued NSO Group in US court for the attack. I believe that the increased scrutiny that is coming from groundbreaking reporting all around the world, every week you hear about more completely shocking cases of abuse from spyware. I think that's incredibly important to put scrutiny on the industry and ultimately to create consequences. Tech companies can and should do everything they can to make their products secure. But at the end of the day, there will always be a market for surveillance. There will always be a market to abuse journalists. And there needs to be more than just technological barriers. There need to be consequences. The way this stops is if spyware companies and the people who abuse spyware get in trouble. And so everything everyone is doing to raise attention to the issue, especially journalists all around the world, is critically important for creating that accountability and for getting governments involved. Recently, the Biden administration put NSO Group on a sanctions list, so US companies cannot do business with them. That is a good first step, but there need to be a lot more consequences.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you very much. Dr. Khan, we have seen last year the amount of exposés about surveillance, about technology available, about what is happening. And you're one of the persons around the world, of the experts around the world, proposing this moratorium on the transfer and sale of technology. How could something like this be implemented? I mean, it seems very, very difficult, or something difficult to achieve. I mean, what do you suggest?
It is difficult to achieve, but that doesn't mean we should not try. And that is because it's very important. What a moratorium effectively is, a global moratorium, is just freezing the sale, transfer, and use until proper rules are put into place. Now, as a lawyer, I believe in law. I believe in rights. Ethics are fine. We need them. But ethical standards and guidelines are not going to fix the problem here. The purpose of the moratorium is that we need to stop. We all know now, especially now that we know, thanks to all the work the journalists have done and researchers and others, we now know how damaging it is to have this kind of digital targeted surveillance. People are being killed, lives are being destroyed, international relations have been affected, as we know, and of course public trust is being lost. So knowing all that, do we just let this continue while we seek to fix the problem? No. We should have a ban put into place while we fix the problem. And what do I mean by fixing the problem? I think a lot of responsibility has to lie with governments, individually and collectively. They need to introduce, governments need to take seriously their human rights obligations. You see, the reason why I'm skeptical about ethics is because we have a framework. We heard the High Commissioner for Human Rights talk about a legal framework that exists, and that is the framework for human rights. Use that and strengthen national laws. There are rules about when governments can surveil and when they cannot. It has to be done for very limited purposes. It has to be proportionate. It has to be necessary. And then introduce independent oversight of the use of surveillance by governments, whether it's a judicial body or a quasi-judicial body, strong one, and provide remedies. Mr. Cathcart talked about litigation. It's very difficult to litigate this issue because you don't have the evidence. You know, this is an industry that operates in a very opaque manner. So there must be clear remedies. And I would argue that there must be a very high bar that governments have to cross if they want to surveil human rights defenders or journalists or certain categories of people. Because what they're saying is they're going to use tools that are meant for criminals, that are meant for terrorists against human rights defenders, people like me, journalists like you. Then let the government go in front of an independent body and prove why. So there has to be a very high standard. So there are certain national things that have to happen. I also think that export control has to be brought in here with a human rights orientation. To whom are these types of tools being sold? It has been done for landmines. It's been done for small arms. So I think this kind of technology should fall into that category. I commend Costa Rica for having actually introduced a moratorium, and I would encourage Costa Rica to work with other states in this region to expand that moratorium. The European Parliament has now set up a committee of inquiry to investigate. The Indian Supreme Court has set up an inquiry, so we can see that what journalists have done, what researchers have done, exposure and disclosure is leading to some action, and we have to keep pushing, and we have to keep the pressure on that. And then, of course, when it comes to corporations, don't just believe that corporations that work in this kind of a business will just become good and do it. Regulation has to come with teeth. Regulate them, but then make sure that there are consequences if they break the regulation.
Thank you very much.
Bien. Y ahora también.
Now, running after you, Claudia, as a journalist that has been abused, what do you think about those solutions being proposed? Okay, just a minute to say that the idea of the moratorium is excellent. Anyhow, I think the key word is accountability. And how do we reach it? First, making states reckon that the violations related with the right of privacy and intimacy are major crimes. Most legislations in the world believe this felony. And we must begin to granting more importance to this. That is the most massive violation of human rights we're suffering now as citizens, not only journalists. So it requires to be reclassified and considered a major crime. This will lead to investigations and penal sanctions, not only civil sanctions, because it's quite easy to manage to be reimbursed for a violation due to privacy as compared to a conviction due to a crime, because it's considered felony. And at judicial level, there's a real lack of knowledge about the meaning and the connection there is between violating the privacy of a journalist and then torturing, killing, and kidnapping them. On the other hand, I think it's good to speak of public policies, but these public policies must be made into real guidelines and administrative resolutions so that the officials ultimately stop with this practice of invading our privacy, be it with the excuse of protection or the suspicion that because we're critical, that's wrong. On the other hand, private companies and corporations such as WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, well, must work harder in relation to stopping these practices, because some accounts are promoting hate speech and also working against us, investigating us and threatening us, a death threat. I received one last week due to an opinion I had in relation to something happening in our country. So I think accountability isn't only saying, well, and something else that is very important. In the contracts with the private companies, we should eliminate the confidentiality clause, because we can't be ignorant of many facts, such as the price and many more things. They're only promoting sales and marketing of technology, attacking human rights defenders and journalists, and that goes unpunished. We should work with the private companies not only to strengthen vulnerabilities or preventing somebody from hacking your systems. These companies must also be transparent with the general public, citizens, and journalists, showing their contracts so we can really know about NSO, not what governments purchase their software, but for what uses. And so we're aware about the GPS installed in the different vehicles and to what satellites they're sending the information and to which companies are selling the information. I think those contracts are really a cause of shame, and that in this world, as Marcelo said now, this is in the name of freedom, of liberty. Everybody's informing through Twitter or whatever, but this is a real mix-up, transforming us into the slaves of companies, and it could belong to Elon Musk or whoever. But what I really care for is that these platforms be clear about who in government is using our information, because it isn't only an issue of marketing, that it is, or of controlling our taste, and it is, but it's also related to the direct safety of the people conducting journalism in this context. Thank you so much.
Just information, really. I mean, this really makes a difference. Thank you very much. Let's all stand up. We're gonna.
Muchísimas gracias. Gracias.
So please stay with us. We have a high-level segment now. We're also going to be giving away the Guillermo Cano Awards ceremony. And please, please share this conversation online on your social media networks with the hashtag World Press Freedom Day. Thank you. Yes, please stay seated. We have a high-level segment now. For those who are interested, it's important for those of you to be here.
Querido Luis,